A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a group of villains sat around a table and said, "What if we made all the worst decisions at once?" And thus, the Death Star was born. Not one, but two of them. Let me just say, this isn't going to be a video about how cool the Death Star looked, or how intimidating it was. No, this is a video about what happens when an empire that spans the galaxy gets run like a failing corporate startup. We're talking about moon-sized space stations that were so expensive, they probably gave accountants across the galaxy a nervous breakdown. Weapons of mass destruction that weren't just flawed, they were a masterclass in how not to do anything. These weren't symbols of power. They were overcompensating billion-credit disasters that fell apart faster than stormtroopers during target practice. So buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into one of the most baffling strategic failures in science fiction history. We're talking bad planning, bad design, bad budgets, bad everything. By the end of this, you'll wonder if the Rebel Alliance even needed the Force, or if the Empire was always destined to implode under the weight of its own incompetence. Because here's the thing, the Death Star isn't just a cautionary tale for galaxy-dominating despots. It's a lesson for all of us. A lesson in hubris, arrogance, and why you should never put all your eggs in a giant, exploding basket. Let's get started. Before we dive into today's video, I just want to say thank you to all of you who are subscribed to the channel. Less than 4% of you are actually subscribed. I love making these videos and love waking up to comments from both good and bad. You might not always agree with me, and that's okay. If you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. It's free and only takes a second. Thank you for being here. Now let's get back to the video. Alright folks, let's dive into the mind of the Empire. Imagine you're running the most powerful, tyrannical regime in the galaxy. You've got fleets of Star Destroyers, legions of stormtroopers, and more resources than any sane person could ever hope to spend. You decide to build a weapon so ridiculously massive it could destroy entire planets, just to send a message. Fine, I get the intimidation factor, but then it gets blown up by a guy whose biggest accomplishment before that was bullseeing womp rats in his backyard. What do you do next? If you're any kind of rational leader, you regroup. You rethink your strategy. Maybe you spread out your resources, improve your defenses, or focus on ships that don't cost more than the combined GDP of 1,000 star systems. But no, the Empire's response was, "Hey, remember that Death Star thing that didn't work? Let's just build another one." Not only that, but they made it bigger. Because obviously size was the issue last time. At this point, I don't even blame the rebels for blowing them up. It's like the Empire was practically handing them the keys to their own downfall. And the craziest part, nobody in the Empire thought this was a bad idea. Not one person raised their hand during a meeting and said, maybe we shouldn't pour all our time, money, and effort into another giant floating bullseye. The Emperor's inner circle must have been a real brain trust. Either that, or Palpatine was so scary that nobody dared to question his galactic midlife crisis. Let's talk about money, because the Death Star isn't just a weapon. It's the most expensive piece of stupidity in galactic history, according to some very smart people with way too much time on their hands. The first Death Star would have cost around 850 quadrillion credits to build. That's quadrillion with a Q. To put that into perspective, if you taxed every citizen of the galaxy, including the people living in huts on Tatooine, you still wouldn't come close to covering it. And that's just the initial construction cost. You've got maintenance, power generation, crew salaries, janitors to mop the floors, cafeteria workers to keep Darth Vader fed. It's a logistical nightmare. And for what? A weapon so over-engineered that one well-placed shot can blow it to pieces. It's like buying the most expensive sports car in the galaxy, but forgetting to put gas in it. And let's not forget the sheer inefficiency of it all. With the resources they spent on 2 Death Stars, the Empire could have built a fleet of Star Destroyers big enough to blot out the suns. They could have upgraded every TIE fighter with shields and made stormtrooper armor that actually worked. But no, they went all in on one project twice and lost everything because of it. Now we come to the part everyone knows. The exhaust port. The single greatest design flaw in the history of engineering. I'm still not over this. The Death Star is a moon-sized space station. It's got thousands of turbolasers, shields strong enough to withstand planetary attacks, and enough firepower to obliterate planets. And yet, the whole thing can be destroyed by shooting a single torpedo into a conveniently exposed exhaust port. Who signed off on this? Imagine being the engineer who had to explain that to Darth Vader. Yes, Lord Vader, the station is impenetrable, unless someone happens to fire a missile into this one specific spot. But don't worry, it's only 2 meters wide, so it's totally fine. Meanwhile, rebel pilots are like 2 meters. That's literally the size of my ego. I got this. You'd think the Empire would have learned their lesson after the first explosion. But no. The second Death Star wasn't just flawed, it was unfinished. They didn't even bother to cover up the giant holes in the construction. Did they think the rebels were just going to ignore it because it wasn't fully operational? That's like leaving your front door wide open and assuming burglars will politely wait until you've finished installing the locks. The sheer arrogance is staggering. The Empire didn't just underestimate the rebels, they overestimated themselves. They thought their enemies were too weak, too disorganized to exploit their mistakes. But as we all know, a scrappy band of underdogs with nothing to lose will always find a way, especially if you're practically begging them to blow up. Here's what really baffles me: the Empire's complete inability to think strategically. They had fleets of star destroyers, entire armies of stormtroopers, and enough resources to overwhelm any opposition. But instead of spreading their power across the galaxy, they poured everything into one giant shiny target. It's the galactic equivalent of putting all your savings into a single stock and then being shocked when it crashes. The rebels, on the other hand, had no such delusions of grandeur. They were scrappy, resourceful, and smart. They didn't need a giant space station to fight back. They just needed clever tactics and a willingness to improvise. You don't see Mon Mothma saying, "Let's build a massive superweapon that can only fire once before it runs out of fuel." No, because she understands basic military strategy. The Empire's obsession with scale was their undoing. They thought bigger always meant better. But bigger also means slower, more vulnerable, and a lot more expensive to replace when it inevitably blows up. And honestly, it's a lesson for us all. Power doesn't come from size or intimidation. It comes from flexibility, adaptability, and not being an egotistical maniac. The rebels proved that time and time again. They didn't just defeat the Empire. They outsmarted them at every turn, using the Empire's own arrogance against them. Now, let's spare a moment for the poor souls who had to build these monstrosities. You think the Empire had the galaxy's best engineers working on the Death Star? No way. No self-respecting architect is going to sign off on a space station with a critical weakness the size of a womp rat. They probably outsourced the whole thing to the cheapest contractors they could find, which explains a lot. Imagine the conversations in the Imperial break room. "So, what do you do?" "Oh, I'm a structural engineer on the Death Star." "You?" "I install guardrails over the bottomless pits." "Just kidding, we don't have those." Budget cuts. These people probably knew the whole project was doomed, but kept quiet because, well, it's not like you can unionize under the Empire. And let's not forget the millions of innocent workers who died when both Death Stars exploded. Plumbers, electricians, cafeteria staff. They weren't evil. They were just trying to make a living. But because Palpatine and Vader had galaxy-sized egos, these people became collateral damage. At this point, the Empire isn't just evil, it's wildly irresponsible. If anything, the destruction of the Death Stars was less a victory for the rebels, and more a tragic lesson in what happens when you put the galaxy's most incompetent leaders in charge. Maybe if the Empire had treated their workers better, someone would have spoken up about the glaring design flaws. But alas, dictatorship isn't exactly conducive to constructive feedback. Here's the bottom line. If you're an evil galactic regime looking to maintain power, maybe don't pour all your resources into a giant murder moon with a giant weak spot. Build a diverse fleet. Upgrade your TIE fighters so they don't explode when someone sneezes on them. Train your stormtroopers so they can actually hit a target. It's not rocket science. The Death Star wasn't just a symbol of the Empire's power. It was a symbol of their arrogance. They thought they were invincible, that no one could challenge them. But in the end, their greatest enemy wasn't the rebels or the Force. It was their own hubris. The Empire didn't lose because the rebels were stronger. They lost because they were too blind to see their own mistakes. And that's the real tragedy. The Empire had the resources to rule the galaxy forever. They could have crushed the rebellion with ease if they'd just used a fraction of the brainpower that went into designing Darth Vader's helmet. But instead, they chose the path of over-the-top superweapons and bad management. So, to all the future tyrants of the galaxy, take notes. If you build not one, but 2 Death Stars, you're not a genius. You're not even evil in an interesting way. You're just the cautionary tale we'll all laugh about for generations. So what have we learnt today? We've learnt that if you're going to run an empire, maybe don't spend your entire budget on a giant murder ball with a glaring weakness that even a rookie pilot can exploit. Think about it. They had everything. Resources, manpower, advanced technology. But instead of using it wisely, they dumped it all into one shiny, doomed project twice. They ignored every possible warning sign, every obvious flaw, because they were too blinded by their own egos to see what was right in front of them. The Death Star wasn't a triumph of engineering. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets bad leadership. And let's be honest, the rebels didn't win because they had better ships or bigger armies. They won because they used common sense. They saw the Empire's ridiculous plans and said, yeah, we can work with that. The Death Stars weren't destroyed by superior firepower. They were destroyed by hubris, overconfidence, and maybe a little bit of Force-guided luck. So here's my advice to any aspiring galactic tyrants out there. Don't be the Empire. Don't build Death Stars. Diversify your plans. Listen to your engineers. And for the love of all that's good and holy, stop making giant space stations with exhaust ports that double as self-destruct buttons. Because if you don't, you won't need rebels to take you down. You'll do it all by yourself. Thanks so much for watching. I spend a good bit of time making sure each video is great. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It really helps out and means a lot to me. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next one.